Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. Wanted to share my favorite fiction reading from last year. Now, these aren't necessarily books that were published in 2023, but rather books I read last year and absolutely loved. These are the books that have stayed with me, whether in my head or in my heart. They resonate still with the way that I think about stories that we share across cultures, across our times, the way that we relate to the world, to each other, to ourselves. And so I loved each of these books. Most of them I have a full video on, so I'll include links to those in the description box. And I just want to give sort of a brief preview about why was each of these books such a valuable moment in my reading last year. And I always like to wait a few days because some 15 years ago, the very last book I finished in a year, the book I finished on December 31st in 2008 was Snow Country by Kawabata Yasunari, which was probably my favorite book I read that year. And I always like to just take a few days, make sure I've gone through the list, what is still hanging with me. So, in no particular order, we're going to start off with Satan Tango by Krasznahorkai Laszlo. This is the first book in Krasznahorkai's tetralogy that runs through Melancholy of Resistance, War and War, and then Baron Venkheim's Homecoming, most recently published and most recently translated into English. And so I'm in the process of sort of rereading that whole group of books to finish with Baron Venkheim's Homecoming. And this hit me in a different way this time. Melancholy of Resistance captured me right away the first time I approached it. Satan Tango, this time I saw so much more going on. I saw so many more parallels, perhaps knowing what was going to happen and how Krasznahorkai would develop stories, the different ways he plays with some of the themes across Satan Tango and Melancholy of Resistance. There was just more that I appreciated this time. It has stayed with me in different ways. There are certain images that stay with me, certain ways that he uses language to reveal just how crushing an environment and a society can be, and the way that humanity sparks into flame in unexpected ways. And literally in this book seems to spark into flame in ways that are totally unexpected. And what that means, what that collision between the sparks that flare up for just a moment in a world of shadow and darkness and gray, what that means for a person. And so this is a great book. If you've never read it, I'd highly recommend it. And I believe it was Krasznahorkai's birthday this week. So dive in. Up next, another reread is the great Our Sister Killjoy by Ama Ata-Edu. I reread this almost a year ago, and it had been close to a decade since I had first approached the book. And again, I still just absolutely love this, the way that Edu is able to reveal so many different aspects of life in the African diaspora community. What it means to leave her home and to venture out into this world where she's supposedly going to learn about how to be, in a sense, more of a person. And then she could potentially go back to her community and try to help them learn these same lessons she has experienced. But to reveal how hollow so many of those promises are, so many of those aspirations are, and to reveal the core of humanity is just fascinating. It's an indelible book. This is absolutely one that stays with me across many years. Up next, A Tomb for Boris by Danilo Kish, Serbian writer, writing though during sort of the Cold War, under the totalitarian regime, where the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia had some independence from the Soviet Union's control, but still there was very much just a dangerous sense of what was going on. And the way that these stories draw on history, and in a sense are almost like an occult history of political, and revolutionary changes in Eastern Europe across the 20th century. And an occult history, not in the sense of the occult, but the type of history that fiction correcting history's mistakes, in a sense. Kish is a master. I'm looking forward to reading Garden Ashes this year from him, but this was fantastic. Up next, sort of a pairing of books. One book I was approaching in December, and one that I had read earlier in the year, and that would be Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo and The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Dark academia works that spiral in very interesting directions and have this compulsive sense to the narrative. The Secret History is justifiably a very famous book. It's been a totem, I think, among a certain type of reader for some 30 years now. Additionally, Ninth House, I think, taps into that vein, and it's always interesting to see a writer or a book that is expanding on a foundation that some other writer has laid in some other novel. I really enjoyed Ninth House. I know some folks think it's perhaps too juvenile. I did not find that. I loved this book. If you've never read one of Leigh Bardugo's more adult novels, give this one a shot. You might really enjoy it. It is firmly sort of there's some fantasy in this, some ghosts, but it's legitimately horrifying in ways that aren't horrifying because of the ghosts, but are horrifying because of what happens to a character, a human. And that is sort of a crucial, I think, detail in horror or in fantasy. So I love this. I'm going to be reading the sequel, Hellbound, next year or this year, and I'm hoping to enjoy that. All right. In another book that I think perhaps I knew the title of, but I didn't know anything about last year, would be But Crime Does Punish by Jan Johannides. And this is the first book I've ever read from Slovakia. I was really impressed by this book. It's very small, and I read it sort of as we were on a train going through Central Europe, passing by Bratislava, and sort of the Slovakian border. This book does something I don't know that I've ever found in another book, and it has a second-person narrator, almost within a mystery. Jay McInerney had a second-person narrator and point of view in Bright Lights, Big City, but here it's this sense of question and answer, but the questions the reader is asking to the narrator are unspoken. And it's a character who seems to be almost telling his story, sharing what's going on, and he's doing it through this long monologue, but it's clear that he's responding to questions that we're asking, but that we don't actually know what the questions are asking. So there's this interactive pull to it. And it's a short book, so it's this very hypnotic, interactive pull that pulls you deeper and deeper into his story. And the final page just has a twist, has this, it's not perhaps shattering, it's shattering for the character in the novel. It may not be shattering for the reader, but it has this deep, like almost Baroque push-pull effect going on that's very effective. I've not really encountered too many works that do something like that. And we see what's going on. What was life like in then Czechoslovakia, when Slovakia was sort of dominated by Czech officials, and that they in turn were dominated by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And what did that look like? How did individuals experience that? And what could happen on a weird night, one night? If you were just a lower level functionary, just hanging out, and suddenly a group of important people show up and say, hey, we need these things, and then we're all going to go drink together in the back of this truck, and you're coming with us. That we get a sense of that, but we get a sense of so much more across this book. So I'd highly recommend But Crime Does Punish. Up next, one of my favorite current writers, someone who is actively writing and producing works now, is Ariana Harwitz. I think she's brilliant. I thought Die My Love was one of the most harrowing books I'd encountered in a few years, and Feeble Minded picks up right off from Die My Love, takes it in a new direction, equally harrowing in a very different way. Here, instead of sort of a mother thinking about her child and her husband and sort of her relationships, we seem to have a mother and daughter together, tugging against each other, and we see the conflict there, but also the ties that continue to tie them up and bind them together. This is an incredible book. It has, again, a propulsive narration, a sense of time and place that continues to filter through in weird and strange ways. There are little details that reveal that time has been passing for these characters, even though it's never explicitly stated in the novel. And so I will be approaching the end of sort of this trilogy of books she's written this year, and I can't imagine she's going to close it out in any other way than with another wonderful, wonderful short novel. So, Feeble Minded. Up next, another absolutely propulsive narrator, sort of grouping these together, The Loser by Thomas Bernhard. I read a few books by him last year in conjunction with Jason from Channel of a Disappointed Man, sort of leading a year-long reading of Bernhard's books. And this narrowly edged out Old Masters. There are ways that The Loser, I think, has stayed in my mind more than Old Masters. And I read Old Masters while we were in Vienna, while I was able to go see the painting of the old man. at the Kunsthistorische Museum, and it was an incredible experience. But the loser has something else. The loser possesses a sense of disappointment and a sense of grasping, a sense of wanting perfection, craving it, seeing perfection somewhere else, seeing someone who has reached one's aspiration, and then the crushing sense of knowing I may never get there. And how do you deal with that? How do you reconcile that? I think it's one of those sort of universal emotions that adults experience. And Bernhard is one of the finest writers around that sense of disappointment, that sense of loss that comes, and the way it's filtered across a couple of different characters' feelings and their own sense of themselves is shattering, I think, in many ways. This is just an absolutely fantastic book. It might be his best book. I'm not sure. I haven't read all of them yet. It's the one that I think has reached the highest heights and perhaps plumbed the lowest depths of human emotion. But I don't know that I would make this my first novel from Bernhard. I think Concrete might be a better first approach. Gargoyles might even be a better first approach. But this has that sort of Bernhard sense of just, there's almost no sentence breaks. There's no real chapter breaks. You're just propelling through this narrative. Someone is unspooling everything within the stream of consciousness, and absolutely amazing. Up next, a book that I'll talk about, I think, in a second video as well. But it is a fictional narrative. It's perhaps a novel in verse, and it's translated into verse, but that would be Layli and Majnun by Nizami Ganjabi, translated by Dick Davis. This is a Persian novel from the 12th century, and it is a long poem. It is a romance. It is absolutely marvelous. So I read Vicent Ramin by Fakhreddin Gorgani in 2022. In 2023, I jumped up to Layli and Majnun, and this has so much going on. If you've never tried reading sort of a Persian classic, this might be one of the best ones to start with right away. There are wonderful images, wonderful metaphors, and that's one of the great aspects of reading, works from other cultures, or particularly works from other cultures and other times, is seeing the types of images, the types of metaphors that individuals in a different place, in a different time, could come up with. How do they conjure emotions and feelings that we still experience? And how did that look from their point of view? How would they see our world through their eyes? And so that's one of the beauties of reading, translated literature. But here we're in the hands of an absolute master, someone who understood so much detail about humanity, but also just could unleash beautiful torrents of words to in a sense almost create this garden around us. The depth of feeling here, the way that Nizami works to have his characters interacting on sort of a mythic, historic level, and also within the cultural context of the 12th century in Iran or Persia, is absolutely incredible, and sort of a Romeo and Juliet, a Tristan and Isolde, but I highly recommend it. Then, now, the next four will be sort of the four that I think are probably my favorite, along with The Loser, maybe it is five. My favorite, true top favorites, the ones that I know I'm going to come back and reread, the ones that I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about and returning to, every decade that remains in my life. One of those is Faces and Masks, the middle volume in the Memory of Fire trilogy by Eduardo Galeano. It's hard to describe what Galeano actually accomplishes in these books. I think these might be the most unsung masterpiece of the 20th century in world literature. I'm really starting to think that. I want to finish the trilogy with Century of the Wind. But what Galeano accomplished is something I don't think there's any parallel for in 20th century literature. He took primary sources, secondary sources, and he draws actual sentences from primary sources, but then creates fictional narration around them to give these snapshots of life in South America, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, North America, across centuries. And so Genesis goes from the beginnings of time all the way up through roughly the year 1700 in the Common Era. This then runs for the next 200 years, 1700 to 1900 in the Common Era. And so this is a time of great change. We see how there are indigenous voices, and the way that they pushed back against the depredations of colonial governments, and you know, the violence that they encountered. Voices of individuals who had been enslaved in Africa and brought over. Voices of the people, you know, who were in that government, and how they were sort of looking at it and thinking around what they were doing, the horrors they were committing. This, of course, has the immortal Simón Bolívar as a crucial voice, but it also has these little seeds and previews where we get a single tiny snapshot of the birth of Augusto Sandino, who will be a crucial voice and personage in Century of the Wind, the final volume. And so it creates this literary mosaic, and this historical mosaic across centuries of time and across numerous lands, numerous voices, in a way that I truly don't know of anyone who's ever written anything like that. And I wish everyone would experience these 3 books. There's nothing quite like them. So that's Memory of Fire by Eduardo Galeano. Up next, the fantastic, just absolutely incredible Juneteenth by Ralph Ellison. I had been put off from this novel for a long time because I'd heard it wasn't as good as Invisible Man. It was published posthumously, and he hadn't really published it. He had appointed somebody who sort of drew from the enormous corpus of writing that existed to create this novel. It's fantastic. It is some of the best writing Ellison's ever done. The way that he continues to probe at ideas around race in the U.S., around sort of one's birth parents versus one's sort of mentors versus one's chosen identity, and found identity. All of these ideas are just pushed into this crucible, and Ellison lights it on fire. He does it in a way that only he could do. And I would really encourage you, if you've read Invisible Man, if you've read writers like Faulkner or Toni Morrison, and you've never approached Juneteenth, consider it. Look for a copy at your library. It really is a rewarding reading. The last 2 books that are sort of in my favorites, one of them is the very first book I read last year. It was actually the first book I wrote down in my reading list for 2023. That's Aiva by Clarice Lispector. That's being borrowed by someone because it's such a brilliant book, but Clarice Lispector. And that is a book that's not a novel proper. It is not a book that has this long narrative around characters and things like that. It is rather almost these reflections, these aphorisms, a diary almost of sorts. There's a very personal nature to the Aiva, and I thought it was masterful. There are so many pages that I was sort of like folding the corner of the page down, thinking, okay, there's something on this page I need to remember. Go back and find it. And I just found myself immersed in the book. I would read it. I would reread pages from it and passages from it. It's a book that really captures Lispector's wonderful fractured sense of our lives and of our universe, and the way that she was reconciling her own mind, I think, in some ways, to experiences. And it's an absolute perfect gem of a book. And the last one then is a book that was, I believe, of the books I read last year, maybe with Ninth House, the most recently published book, and that's Of Cattle and Men by Ana Paula Maia, who's a writer from Brazil. It was published by Charco Press, and it is set on essentially a slaughterhouse by the side of a river in rural Brazil. And the way that the character, when I described the book, I said it's almost like a series of dispatches from the edge of hell. There's something that feels like Ana Paula Maia that is writing in the same vein as writers like Cormac McCarthy and Blood Meridian, books that feel right there on the edge of like a nihilistic point of view, that this is a world of violence, of horror, and one's assertion of one's own identity is ultimately going to slide into those types of acts. It is a harrowing book. It is a book that is bloody and visceral, and it's also absolutely incredible and beautiful. So if you've never read Of Cattle and Men, you haven't seen that yet, highly recommend that one. So those were my favorite books I read last year. I have sort of couple more books I want to mention, two that are sort of honorable mentions. One is the fantastic Mexico set by Len Dayton. I think this book is this is the book that sort of elevates the Game Set Match trilogy, because it takes Berlin Game that was so sort of interior and claustrophobic, and it expands the world of Bernard Sampson. It expands the consequences. There's a higher body count. So I read this, reread this summer, and then my wife was reading it as well, and she and I both really just enjoyed discussing how they developed some interesting ideas in here. And then Sunflower by Trudy Jula. This is a very strange novel from Hungary. It is it's steeped in sort of 19th century, almost like romantic ideas, and then it has these impressionist moments. There are moments that feel ghostly and very, very strange. It's a book that I want to reread and approach again, having sort of experienced it in its totality, come back to it, because I think it's a fascinating book. And it'll probably be on a future one of these. And then finally, two books that I'm in the middle of reading that I'm absolutely loving, and one of them I'm going to finish this year. The other one I may finish this year, and if I don't, what I want to do is probably split it up. But the first is Emperor of the Sorcerers by Budhasvamin, and this is from India, northern India, and it was written in Sanskrit. It's an abridgment of the great Brihat Katha, the great story, the long story from Gunadya, and it's just incredible. I'm going to finish volume 2 this year, and I'll sort of do a discussion around these, but this is one that is very, very fascinating, very interesting, has a great sense of energy, and it was written at the latest sometime in the 10th century. So that's been fantastic. The other is continuing to read Outlaws of the Marsh by Xin Yan or Lua Guozong. Not quite sure necessarily who wrote it, but it's from the 14th century. It's set in sort of, I believe, northern China of that period, and it deals with these characters. It's an adventure novel, but it deals with these characters. In each episode, it sort of ends on a climax, like, oh, they were accosted by this group of bandits, and what happened next, dear reader? You have to find out. But I'm about a third of the way through it. I'm going to be close to the halfway point soon, and I might do a video then, because the book is some 120, I believe it's 100 chapters, and it's about 2,000 pages long total. Sometimes it's known as the water margin. I think a more recent translation had it as All Men Are Brothers. This is a really fascinating, truly like adventure book. And I understand, if I understand correctly, it's going to take a sort of tragic turn later on. But I might do a video at sort of the halfway point, talking about the book, what I've been appreciating about it, because this is just a really fun one. So I hope everyone's doing well. This is my favorite fiction in 2023. And I'll do another video with some nonfiction, poetry, things like that. But hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.